China's Finance Minister Xiao Jie suggested that legislation for a property tax would be completed by 2019 and would place a levy on industrial, commercial and residential properties. What impact will this have on China's housing market? Unlike the US and other Western countries where people can own their property, Chinese citizens do not actually own the permanent rights to their homes. They just hold 70-year leases on the properties. What is the legal basis for a property tax in China? Housing is for people to live in, not for speculation, has been the tone-setting slogan for China's real estate market. Will a property tax help solve the problem of speculation in Chinese real estate? In 2011, property tax pilot programs were rolled out in Shanghai and Chongqing, but it seems the levy has done little to help curb increasing house prices. Why have the pilot programs failed to rein in property prices?
China is considering adopting a property tax to tame the property market. In a policy statement published in the People's Daily, China's Finance Minister Xiao Jie confirmed that the legislation for introducing a property tax would be completed by the year 2019 and its enforcement may come as early as 2020. So how will a property tax affect the housing market? Will it discharge local government's reliance on one-time land sales? And how would it impact the wealth of Chinese households? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Mr. Mo Tianquan, who is the board chairman of Fund.com. And via satellite, we're going to talk to Mr. Yu Pingkang, who is the chief economist with Changjiang Pension Insurance. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to Dialogue, Mr. Mo. The issue is whether China is ready for a property tax.
I think the topic has been in discussion for more than 10 years, as far as I know, because I'm in the discussion also in the past 10 years. Most recently, the Minister of the Finance announced something which says by the end of 2019, the legislative procedure will be complete, and theoretically, the property tax could start from 2020. My experience, and I would not expect that it's going to be done so quickly.
You mean it will be done and executed step by step? It should be pushed forward very carefully for fear of causing strong rebound from the general public?
I think, theoretically, technically it can be done by 2019. But in the process, I think there are several factors which may delay this process. Tax is it is an economic issue. It is also a political issue, and there are techniques in it, like the property appraisal things. So theoretically, it can be done by 2019, but I doubt. There are many things which can come out which may delay this process, but eventually I think a property tax should be in place like many other countries in the world.
Right. The general public do have some strong concerns, Mr. Yu Pingkang. Do you think China is ready to accept a very controversial property tax, quote-unquote?
Well, I would say, China is more or less ready, in a sense that there are several, ways to look at this issue. First of all, from the government perspective, is that during the past several years of the economic downturn, and also particularly since the financial deleveraging process started since the fourth quarter of 2016, then the local governments are really eager to generate the second source of revenue, because before that, the land sales tax, essentially the land transaction tax accounts for more than 50% of the local government revenue. So now with this housing market becomes cooled down, the local government really are eager to find the second source of revenue. And second, I think there is a kind of preparatory kind of infrastructure work for this type of issue to be ready. So one is a database issue. Now we know that it's almost ready, almost done already. That means the database to connect the different cities. And second is a legislative framework. We believe that it will, some of the major piece of work will be introduced during the 2 sessions in the coming March. And a third issue is that you just mentioned where the Chinese people, particularly urban residents, are ready to accept this concept of this property tax, because by kind of a legal kind of concept, this land has already been taxed, before the housing was built, right? So I think that one way to look at this is to a good analogy to look at this is to look at the toll fee for the highway, right? We pay the tax. The people pay the tax to the government to let the government to build the highway. So people don't own the highway, but when people want to drive the car onto the highway to use the highway, they still have to pay the right to use. So I think that essentially the property tax, the tax for use, can be introduced from this angle.
China has entered into a new normal in the supply side economic restructuring. Having said this, owners of small and medium-sized enterprises in major urban areas have long complained that they have been excessively taxed. How should we unleash the dynamics of this segment, the non-public segment of the Chinese national economy, if we were to tax the industrial and commercial segments brutally based on the government's appraisal of the values? Well, of course, the residential areas should also be taxed. I mean, taxes would be levied on this part of the business. So what do you think of the strength of a rebound from these 3 different areas?
I think the tax issue is it's a political issue, and it's also an economic issue. It's a way or a tool to redistribute incomes among individuals and business entities and the government, different governments. So whatever government to do and about the tax, and definitely the government needs to get some opinions from the public. And property tax, it's a broad tax. It relates to individuals and to small and medium-sized business entities, and also relates to big companies or entities as well. So I think, that's why at the beginning I said the legislative procedure may not, complete by 2019 because it's too complicated. And as you just mentioned, currently China has already had the very high level of tax among most countries of the world. So if we're going to have a new tax, and it relates to many people, and I think the government must be very careful in doing it. Although legally or theoretically it works, still I think there are a lot of considerations that need to be considered before the government really execute the tax.
Historically, we did have some lessons to review. For example, quite a few years ago, when the property law was approved by the National People's Congress, our top legislature, it was enacted after 8 readings, because it has a lot to do with the relationship between the state-owned assets and the privately owned assets. If you were to privatize some of the almost bankrupt state-owned assets, you need to clarify, you need to figure out whether people of the non-public sector would run the risk of illegally annexing the state-owned assets. Having had so many debates about this part of the risks, this law was enacted by the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress. With this in our mind, it's not that simple, right? And this one has so much to do with the big population of the consumers, owners of the homes and private properties.
Much more complicated, actually.
Much more complicated. Yeah. You are right.
It relates to most of the individual families.
Right.
Yeah.
So what do you think of their grievances? I mean, will their grievances be properly channeled to the decision makers and the lawmakers?
I think that's why I've been saying that we must be very careful in dealing with this situation. Like in details, like are you going to tax the first house or apartment of the family, or are you going to tax from the second one or the third one? Or whether the tax rate is going to be different for the first one, second one, or the third one. So there are many things relates to those detailed things. Also, appraiser, the correctness or the fairness of the appraiser of the properties is another technical issue. As far as I know, in the U.S., the property tax has been there for many years, but the appraiser is still something arguable. The real taxable value of the property, most of it is below the fair market value of the property. So I think this whole thing, that's why I said it's going to be tough in the process. I would expect, according to my experience, I would not expect it's going to be passed by 2019. It's going to take much longer than what we expected.
But I will leave you there for the moment. You are watching Dialogue with Mo Tianquan and Yu Pingkang. We're discussing why the country may not be ready yet to accept a controversial piece of legislation, for example, the property tax. However, no one should question the political will of the Chinese government. Please stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Vincent and Pingkang, my concern is, of course, about the debates, policy debates. I wonder if policy hearings would be held to reduce the costs of this decision-making process. Now, having said this, what do you think of the famous allegation by President Xi Jinping? He repeatedly said, look, houses are bought for inhabitation. It's not used for speculation. What does he actually mean?
Well, so I think, particularly in the past, a couple of decades, maybe we will say 3 decades or so, the housing, of course, we have already built a lot of housing, but particularly in the first-tier cities. But now, still, a lot of housing units are unoccupied. You can't just count whether the house is the apartment is occupied or not occupied by looking at whether there's a light, from the house, right, at night. So then those unoccupied housing is really, I think, the big issue, because it really raises a kind of wealth divide between different households. So I think that, that I think is served as the kind of background from President Xi's statement. I think that this also received a lot of acclamation from the people. So I think that this is really an important issue to reduce the housing speculation for the investment purpose. But still, the housing still serves the need for for the living need. So I think that this is a basic demand from the people. So this is something that
we need to
really
take a closer look at the stability of the housing market. For example, since heavy taxes are to be levied on not only the industrial and commercial segments, but the ordinary residential areas, in that case, do you expect to have a sharp decline in housing prices as multiple homeowners are likely to dump their properties to avoid being taxed? Do you foresee such a likelihood in the foreseeable future?
Well, I would say, looking at this issue from 2 dimensions. One is time-wise. In time-wise, I don't think there will be, it is kind of a lasting kind of effect. That means introduce a downward kind of trend for the housing price in the housing market. This may introduce one-time impact. For some of the unoccupied housing comes into either the rental market or the sales market. So, but I think that this will only introduce a one-time effect. But of course, when we introduce legislation, it will change people's expectations. So there's certain kind of a time window, maybe 1 year or 2 years before the legislation taking effect. During this time period, there will be some fluctuation in the housing price market. So in the housing price for the housing price in the housing market. But then another dimension to look at it is space-wise, right? So I think that much of the problem for the housing market and also that much of the problem that drives people's concern concentrate in the first-tier city and second-tier city. And then I think that there will be some impact for the housing price in the first-tier, second-tier cities, but for the third and fourth-tier cities, much of the focus of the policy is still about reducing the housing stock, not for these cool down the housing market, right? So I think that we have to look at the issue separately. But again, I think that for the first-tier cities, so for example, once there's some kind of fluctuation for the housing price, particularly when the price start to kind of decline, then it's very easy to fix. Just to kind of lift some of the housing purchasing constraint introduced in the past year, then there will be huge demand, right, for the housing in the first-tier cities. So I think that there will be a lot of support, bottom-up support for the housing price in the first-tier cities. So I think that this issue may become some of the concern to some extent, but it's not a big problem.
Ping-Kang and Vincent, we've been discussing the political will and the legislative work of the government, but what about the banking industry? I mean, a lot of mortgage has been used and consumed by the homeowners. Will that cause the systematic financial risks should decline in the housing prices take place in the near future?
I think there is that possibility. It depends how are we going to tax the properties. Say if we are going to have a very comparatively high tax rate for the second or third properties or houses, apartments, and those owners, they may damp their properties. And if they aggressively damp, and which will lead to a very high supply of the
policy restrictions are likely to be rolled out to prevent such a dumping, tidal dumping, to avoid having spillover effects on the banking system, I'm afraid. Do you think government will have to take into consideration the risks?
That's really the point. So when we are making the policies or the tax policy, we must be very, very careful. Like I just said, if the policy needs to a dumping of property, second or third assets of the family, and which is going to need, it could lead to a sharp decrease of the property price. And if that happens, and the bank has a large accumulation of mortgages and other assets related to the properties. So if that happens, which may also lead to the general economy. So if it happens like this, I will say it will be a failure of the property tax. So before we really finalize the property tax, the process must be very careful, and there must be policy hearings and expert consultants, and also tests among some limited areas, which may help to make sure the policy will be a good one, and the policy will not lead to something unexpected.
Ping-Kang, as China's property market matures, the reduced number of new homes will decrease demand for land. Do you think the property tax will be a source to fill up the shrinking land sales fees? Consequently, will homeowners be held hostage by the new tax reform?
Well, I think that, very much so for the property tax to serve its purpose. That means to generate another source of revenue for the local governments. Because the local, in the past 2 decades, increasingly, the land sales tax or the land transaction tax serves more than half, account for more than 50% of the local government's revenue. So when these local land sales revenue becomes to kind of dry down, then they have to find another source of revenue. So I think from that regard, this property tax really is a good thing. But then for these household concern, right? I think that one thing to remember this is that property tax is the single most fair tax in any tax regime, because it's tax on wealth, it's not tax on income. It will not introduce any tax distortion to the people's behavior. So I think that much of the economic inequality that exacerbate in the past decade, particularly in these couple of years, is largely attributed to the skyrocketing housing price, particularly the first-tier cities. So, by taxing these property housing, I think this will really lower this wealth divide and introduce more kind of economic equality. So I think that this is a really good thing. From the last question you asked, actually.
Yes, go ahead, King Kang. The last question.
Can I add one point to the last question you asked? Whether this decline of the housing price will lead to a banking crisis, right? I think this, is a true concern. But in Chinese context, this is not not an issue to worry, because the loan-to-value kind of ratio, right, is really low in China. In a lot of the housing kind of buyers, only borrow less than 50% of the loan for the purchasing. So even when, in the natural experiment kind of sense, even when the housing price decline to about even 50%, those housing buyers still will not default their mortgage. So I think that that's why this decline of the housing price will not lead to a nationwide banking crisis. So one of the kind of natural experiments looking at in the history is that during the 2008 and 2009, actually in some of the Chinese cities, has already experienced some big decline of the housing price, such as in Wenzhou, in Zhejiang province, etc. But still, it did not lead to a banking crisis, and economic conditions was kind of fairly stable at the time. So I think that as long as the fluctuation of the housing price does not lead to a banking crisis, then systematic banking crisis, then this is not a big problem for us to worry.
Here is a broad question for both of you, Vincent and King Kang. This year marks the 40th anniversary of China's opening up and reform. Now, one major reason for the Chinese economy to have prevailed so remarkably over the past 4 decades, compared with the shock therapy of the Russian Federation in the wake of the Cold War and Soviet disintegration, is that we have adopted a gradualist approach. Now, having said this, taking the property tax as an example, 7 years ago, property tax pilot programs were first rolled out experimentally in 2 major municipalities under the direct administrative control of Beijing, our capital city, to test waters. But it seems the levy has done little to curb the housing prices. If no apparent effects have been felt, what about a comprehensive program of this nature for the whole market in China? Will it pay off?
Well, I think the property tax, the purpose of property tax is not really trying to curb the property price. The property tax is really is trying to create a new revenue for the government, for different levels of government. So, in property price, is decided by multiple factors. Property tax is only one of them, and it may not be the most important one. So we must be clear about the relationship of the property tax and the property price. Secondarily, I think property tax is definitely a negative factor to property price. If we are going to levy property tax, the property price definitely is going to go down. If this is the only factor links to the property price. But at the same time, we have been seeing in the past many years, property price, it's pushed up by demand of the supply, not by property tax. Demand is so strong because there are just so many cash, so much cash in the market.
Excuse me, one reason, Vincent and King Kang. Which is the most expensive in the package of housing market? The land, not the houses. Who owns the land, right?
The government owns the land.
The government owns the land.
Yeah.
Then why it's the consumers and the property developers who should take much of the drag on the economy, who should take much of the burden?
Exactly. That's one arguable, factor. Who owns the land? Who should be taxed? So that's very logical. But now we're talking about property tax, which we're taxing the property, the house owners. They really do not own the land. They own the buildings above the land. So that's one arguable point. So I think, if we levy a national level property tax, whether it's going to decrease the property price. I don't think so. I think the property tax is definitely a negative factor to the national property price level. But as I said, the property price is decided by just too many other factors. Property tax is not the one which is going to lead the decrease of property price or the increase of property price.
Given setbacks in the pilot programs in both Shanghai and Chongqing since 7 years ago, ping pong very quickly, do you keep your fingers crossed for the success of this national program? Will it be a big success, or do you think it's yet again
the difference,
a pilot program?
Right. So the reason the pilot program did not have much effect in Shanghai and Chongqing, mainly because there are two reasons. One, the tax rate is really too low, so it's ignorable, right? Then the second is that you only tax on new housing, not tax on the current housing. So I think that the new legislation will be introduced will be different in these two regards. But I think that more importantly is that who owns the land? It's not the government. The government represents people. So the people collectively own the land, but the government really collects the tax revenue as a kind of income reallocation kind of mechanism, right? To redistribute the income and the wealth. So I think that we have to look at the issue from the higher kind of level. Then I think that in any kind of tax incidence, that means a tax burden, by economic sense, will be shared both by the buyer and seller, depending on the market condition. If this is the supply side market, that means that if there are more kind of buyer than the seller, there are more renter than the landlords, then the more of the tax burden will be bared by the renters. But if this demand side market, then the tax burden will be more bared by the landlords. So, but both of the landlords and renters, and both of the home purchaser and the seller, eventually will share the tax burden.
I'll see you next time. Goodbye, gentlemen.
Thank you.